It was late in the afternoon when I arrived at the small, decrepit motel on the outskirts of town. I had been driving for hours, and my patience was wearing thin. The motel, with its peeling paint and flickering neon sign, looked like something out of a bad dream. I had no other options. I needed a place to rest for the night. The clerk at the front desk handed me a key to room 17, his face etched with a look of deep unease. "There's one thing you should know," he said quietly, glancing around nervously. "Room 17 doesn't have a window, and it's been problematic." I gave him a quizzical look but said nothing. I had no intention of letting an old man's superstitions affect my decision. He muttered something about old buildings and left me with my key. Room 17 was at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. As I walked to my room, I noticed how eerily quiet the place was. The faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of a dripping faucet were the only noises breaking the oppressive silence. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was sparse but functional. There was a single bed covered with a thin, threadbare blanket, a small nightstand, a rickety dresser, and an old TV that looked like it had seen better days. As promised, there were no windows, just a heavy curtain over a small, high-up vent that barely let in any light. The room felt stifling, as if it were trapping the heat and the air. I tried to shake off the discomfort and get some rest. I had an early meeting the next morning, and the last thing I needed was a restless night. However, as soon as I lay down, a sense of unease settled over me. The air in the room was thick and stagnant, and the absence of windows made me feel claustrophobic. I dismissed my growing anxiety as fatigue and forced myself to sleep. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere near the vent. Groggy and irritated, I tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent. I got out of bed and approached the vent, but it was covered by a metal grate that was securely screwed into place. There was no way anything could be tapping from behind it. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. The tapping was accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible murmur that seemed to seep through the walls. It was as if someone was whispering just beyond my reach. I glanced around the room, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Unable to sleep, I decided to go for a walk down the hallway. The motel was eerily silent, with the only light coming from the occasional flickering bulb. I approached the front desk to speak with the clerk, but the desk was empty. There was no sign of anyone. I felt a growing sense of dread, the oppressive atmosphere of the motel weighing heavily on me. As I walked back to room 17, I noticed something unusual. The door to room 15, which was supposed to be locked, was slightly ajar. I could see a sliver of darkness within, and a faint, sickly light flickered inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly pushed the door open. Room 15 was in a state of disarray. The bed was unmade, and the room was filled with old, rotting furniture. The wallpaper was peeling, and the air was thick with a musty, unpleasant odor. The source of the flickering light was an old lamp on the nightstand, its bulb flickering erratically. On the wall opposite the bed was a large mirror covered in a thick layer of grime. The mirror was cracked, and the reflection was distorted. As I approached, I noticed something alarming. The mirror seemed to be moving. The distortion in the glass created shifting, grotesque shapes that seemed to writhe and pulse. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned away from the mirror. The room felt as if it were closing in on me, the air growing colder and more suffocating. I stumbled out of the room, feeling a sense of urgency to escape the oppressive environment. Back in room 17, I tried to calm myself and get some rest, but the tapping sound had grown louder and more frantic, as if someone was desperately trying to get my attention. I lay in bed, my mind racing with paranoia and fear. I could hear the murmuring again, and it seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The nightmares I had that night were fragmented and disturbing. Dark, shadowy figures whispering to me in a language I couldn't understand, endless corridors with locked doors, and the incessant tapping that never seemed to end. When morning came, I awoke feeling disoriented and drained. I quickly packed my belongings and prepared to leave. As I checked out, the clerk was back at the desk, his face as pale as ever. He didn't say a word, but his eyes held a knowing, almost pitying look. I left the motel with a sense of profound relief, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent had been lurking in room 17, and that the entire place was a manifestation of my darkest fears. Months later, I stumbled upon an old news article online about the motel. It described a series of strange and unexplained incidents that had occurred there over the years. Disappearances, eerie noises, and unsettling experiences reported by guests. The article mentioned that room 17 had a history of being closed off due to unexplained phenomena, but it had been reopened to accommodate more guests. The article also included a chilling detail. The mirror in room 15 had once belonged to a previous owner of the motel, a man who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. The mirror was rumored to have a dark history, said to reflect not just physical appearances, but also the deepest fears and anxieties of those who looked into it. The realization that my unsettling experiences were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger, sinister pattern, left me feeling deeply disturbed. The motel, with its windowless room, the relentless tapping, and the eerie mirror, had become a haunting reminder of the unknown and the inexplicable. The darkness that had seeped into my night was a chilling testament to the malevolent forces that seemed to linger within its walls. It all started innocuously enough. I had just moved into this house, a modest place on the outskirts of a small town. It was peaceful, far removed from the bustle of the city where I'd lived for years. The backyard was vast, bordered by thick woods that stretched out for miles. It was exactly what I had wanted. A quiet retreat, somewhere I could work remotely and have a bit of solitude. But it didn't take long for the peace to be shattered in a way I could never have imagined. The first time I saw the figure, it was late at night, maybe around 11 p.m. I was sitting in the living room, mindlessly watching TV when something outside caught my eye. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a subtle movement at the edge of the tree line in the backyard. I brushed it off, thinking it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. This was rural country, after all, and I figured I'd have to get used to the wildlife. But when I looked out the window again, there was something there, standing completely still. At first, I couldn't make out any details. It was just a dark shape, almost blending into the night, standing near the trees about 50 yards away from my house. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to breathe, but I had the unmistakable sensation that it was watching me. I told myself it was just a trick of the shadows, maybe a tree or a tall shrub that my mind was playing tricks with. Still, it unnerved me. I closed the curtains, trying to shake off the unease, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. My heart was racing, and I found myself glancing toward the window again and again, wondering if the figure was still out there, staring. I eventually convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. After all, who would be standing in my backyard in the middle of the night, in a place like this? The next day, I went out to the backyard to reassure myself. I stood at the spot where I had seen the figure the night before, looking around for any evidence that someone had been there. But there was nothing. The ground was undisturbed, No footprints, no broken branches, nothing that indicated anyone had been there. I told myself I had overreacted, that it really had been a trick of the light or my mind playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. The following night, around the same time, I saw it again. This time, closer to the house. The figure was standing near the old shed at the edge of the yard. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared out the window. It was the same shape, the same unnerving stillness, as if whoever or whatever it was had just materialized there. This time, I could make out more details, or rather, the lack of them. It was like a shadow in the shape of a person. Tall, thin, and completely devoid of features. No face, no clothes, no discernible details. Just a black silhouette standing in the dark. I was frozen. Part of me wanted to go out there to confront whoever was trespassing on my property. But another part, the part that was screaming at me that something was terribly wrong, kept me rooted to the spot. I turned off the lights in the house, hoping that if I stayed in the dark, it wouldn't see me. But deep down, I knew it could. I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes that I could see. I stood there in the dark for what felt like an eternity, watching the figure. It never moved, never flinched, just stood there watching. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands trembling as I tried to explain what was happening. They said they'd send someone over, but by the time the officer arrived, the figure was gone. The officer was polite but clearly skeptical. He shone his flashlight around the yard, checked the shed, and walked the perimeter of the property, but there was nothing to find. No signs that anyone had been there. He told me it was probably just an animal or someone passing through, but I could tell he didn't believe anything was wrong. He left after about 15 minutes, reassuring me that it was probably nothing. I tried to convince myself that he was right, but that night I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made my heart pound in my chest. I kept imagining that figure standing somewhere just out of sight, watching me. The next few nights passed without incident, and I started to relax. I told myself it was over, that whatever I had seen was gone. Maybe it really had been a random passerby or just a figment of my imagination. But then one night it came back, and this time it was much closer. I was lying in bed, drifting in and out of sleep when I heard something outside. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the backyard. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped for a moment, everything was silent, and then I heard it. A soft tap coming from the window right next to my bed. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I turned my head slowly, terrified of what I would see, but there was nothing there. No figure, no face pressed against the glass, just darkness. I grabbed my phone, fingers shaking, and called 911 again. I didn't even care if they thought I was crazy. I needed someone here. This time, 2 officers arrived, but again, they found nothing. They did a more thorough search of the property, even walked into the woods with their flashlights, but there was no sign of anyone. They left me with the same vague reassurances that it was probably an animal or my imagination, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe me. The next day, I decided to install security cameras around the house. I thought that if I could catch whatever this was on camera, I'd finally have proof. It took me a few hours, but I got the cameras set up. One pointed at the backyard and one at the side of the house where the figure had been standing near my bedroom window. That night, I sat in the dark, watching the feed from the cameras on my phone, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed and nothing. The backyard was still, the woods quiet. I started to relax, thinking maybe it wouldn't show up tonight. But just as I was about to go to bed, I saw movement on the camera. My blood ran cold. There it was, standing at the edge of the yard, just outside the range of the camera's light. It was barely visible, just a dark silhouette, but it was unmistakably the same figure. It stood there for hours, never moving, never coming closer, just standing at the edge of the woods, watching. The next morning, I checked the footage. The figure was there, just as I had seen it, but when I tried to zoom in or enhance the image, it was as if the figure was absorbing the light. There were no details, no shape, just a void where it stood. Over the next few weeks, the figure continued to appear, always at night, always in the same spot, just standing there. It didn't matter what time I checked, whether it was 10 p.m. or 4 a.m., it was always there, watching. One night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping on my window again. This time, it wasn't soft. It was a loud, insistent knock, like someone demanding to be let in. I grabbed my phone and checked the cameras. The figure was no longer at the edge of the yard. It was standing at the back door. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, sitting in the living room with all the lights on, holding a kitchen knife in my hand, listening to the soft tapping at the back door. It never stopped, just a steady, rhythmic knock, as if it knew I was inside, waiting for me to open the door. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up what I could carry, got in my car, and drove to a friend's house 2 towns over. I haven't been back to the house since. I've tried to rent it out, but no one stays for long. They all leave with the same story, something standing in the backyard, watching. Now, even though I'm miles away, I can still feel it sometimes. When I'm alone, I'll catch a glimpse of something dark standing just at the edge of my vision or hear a soft tap at the window. I don't know what it is or why it's watching me, but I know one thing for sure. It's never going to leave. I was a traveling salesman, frequently on the road for weeks at a time, which often led me to stay in motels scattered across the country. My most recent trip took me through a small, nondescript town where I found myself in desperate need of a place to stay after a long day of meetings and endless driving. I pulled into a rundown motel situated on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered intermittently, casting an ominous glow on the cracked pavement. The check-in process was uneventful. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a grizzled beard and a perpetually troubled expression, handed me the key to room 9 without much conversation. His eyes darted around nervously as he gave me a disjointed farewell. "Stay away from the locked door." Confused by his cryptic warning, I shrugged it off and headed to my room. Room 9 was typical of its kind, small, worn, and sparsely furnished. The bed was covered with a faded floral bedspread, and the TV was a relic from a bygone era. The room had a peculiar musty smell, and the air conditioner rattled incessantly. But what caught my attention was a door at the far end of the room, slightly obscured by a draped curtain. It was not part of the regular room layout and seemed to lead to a small, neglected storage area. I inspected the door and found it locked with a rusted, old-fashioned padlock that looked as if it hadn't been touched in decades. The door was painted a dark, chipped brown, and its edges were lined with dust and cobwebs. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity, especially after the clerk's odd warning. The first night was uneventful. I fell into a fitful sleep, troubled by the thought of what might be behind that locked door. I awoke the next morning feeling unsettled but dismissed it as fatigue and the strange nature of the motel. I spent the day attending meetings and tried to ignore the nagging curiosity about the door. That night, I found myself unable to sleep. The room was too quiet, the hum of the air conditioner now seeming to take on an unnerving quality. Around midnight, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from behind the locked door. The noise was intermittent but distinct, like the sound of something small and sharp scraping against wood. I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling, or perhaps an animal outside, but the scratching persisted. I got out of bed and approached the door, pressing my ear against it. The scratching was louder now, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whispering. I could make out a few words, but they were too garbled to understand. The curiosity was overpowering, so I grabbed a chair and stood on it to examine the padlock. It was old and rusty, but to my surprise, it seemed to be in poor condition, as if it hadn't been used in years. I tried to turn it, and after a few attempts, it gave way with a groan. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, dark room beyond. The room was filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, but what stood out was a large wooden chest in the center. The chest was ancient, its surface intricately carved with strange symbols and designs. A thick layer of dust covered everything, indicating that the room had been untouched for a long time. I hesitated for a moment before approaching the chest. As I drew closer, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the chest itself was calling out to me. With trembling hands, I lifted the heavy lid, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. The chest was filled with old, tattered clothing and personal items, photos, letters, and journals. Most disturbing were the photographs, faded black and white images of people who looked eerily similar to the motel's current staff. There were also some photos of the room I was staying in, but with disturbing additions. Objects in the room had been replaced with strange, unsettling items, and the people in the photos had vacant, hollow expressions. Among the belongings was a journal with a worn leather cover. I opened it carefully and began to read. The entries were disturbing, describing a series of tragic events that had occurred at the motel. The writer spoke of strange noises, disappearances, and inexplicable phenomena centered around room 9. The final entry was the most chilling. The door to the past is unlocked. What's behind it cannot be undone. They are still here. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The realization that the room I had been staying in was connected to something much darker was overwhelming. I quickly closed the chest and locked the door behind me, trying to calm my racing heart. I knew I had to get out of the motel as quickly as possible. I packed my belongings in a frenzy and headed to the front desk. The clerk was nowhere to be found. I waited anxiously, the silence of the empty lobby adding to my growing sense of dread. After what felt like an eternity, the clerk finally appeared, his expression even more troubled than before. "I need to check out immediately," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked at me with a knowing, haunted expression. "Did you find it?" he asked quietly. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I found the locked room," I admitted. He nodded solemnly. "That room was sealed for a reason. It's better you leave now and never come back. The past has a way of catching up with those who disturb it." I left the motel with a sense of profound unease, my thoughts swirling with the implications of what I had discovered. The photographs, the journal, and the locked chest all pointed to a dark, hidden history that had been buried away. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the motel fade into the distance. The feeling of being watched persisted, as if something malevolent was following me, lurking just out of sight. The memories of that night, the scratching, the whispering, and the haunting photographs, haunted me long after I had left. The motel, with its locked door and dark secrets, remained a chilling reminder of the sinister past that should never have been uncovered. It wasn't like I wanted to take the mirror, at least not at first. It was a relic from my grandmother's estate, left to me after her death, like some strange inheritance I never asked for. When the lawyer handed me the list of items, my heart sank seeing it on there. The mirror, I muttered to myself. It wasn't just any mirror, it was the mirror. The one that had hung in her dim, cluttered hallway for as long as I could remember. Ornate, heavy, and old-fashioned, it seemed almost alive, like it had a presence of its own. It was a mirror that people avoided looking into for too long, as if instinctively knowing something wasn't quite right. When I was a child, I'd always felt uneasy around that mirror. I couldn't explain it, but whenever I passed by it, I felt an overwhelming urge to avoid making eye contact with my reflection, as if someone else might be staring back at me. I'd run past it, heart racing, terrified of what I might glimpse if I looked for too long. So when the movers delivered it to my apartment, I tried to find a corner to stash it away, but its size made that impossible. Eventually, I had to hang it up in the hallway just like at my grandmother's house. Felt wrong to put it anywhere else. The ornate golden frame, though tarnished with age, seemed to demand attention, making the narrow hallway feel even smaller, as if it swallowed the space around it. Every time I walked past it, I felt that familiar chill, a sense of being watched. The first few days were quiet, though I still avoided looking directly into the mirror. It was more of an unconscious habit than anything, years of ingrained fear that I hadn't shaken off. I tried to convince myself that the unease was just nostalgia, memories of my grandmother's gloomy old house creeping up on me. After all, it was just a mirror. But then the whispering started. It was subtle at first, so faint that I thought I was imagining it. Late at night, when everything was quiet, I'd hear soft murmurs, too low to make out any words, just an unintelligible hissing, like someone whispering from far away. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was the hum of the refrigerator or the pipes in the walls. Anything but what it really was. But deep down, I knew the sound was coming from the mirror. It got worse each night. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were impossible to ignore. They didn't follow any pattern, just endless, repetitive murmurs that made my skin crawl. And always at night, always when I was alone, I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to block out the sound, but it would seep through the walls and the floors until it felt like it was inside my head. One night, I finally worked up the nerve to confront it. The whispering had been incessant that evening, starting the moment the sun went down. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands shook as I approached the mirror. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as if it was alive, waiting for me. I stood there, staring at the reflection, but everything seemed normal, just me looking back at myself. My apartment hallway, dimly lit, stretched behind me in the reflection. For a moment I felt relieved, even stupid. Of course, nothing was wrong. It was just an old mirror, and I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But then I noticed something. The air around me was still and quiet, yet in the reflection, I saw movement. Not my own, but something subtle in the background, just out of focus. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned in closer. There, in the farthest corner of the reflection, was a figure of faint, almost imperceptible shape. It was blurry, shadow-like, but unmistakably human. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the hallway behind me was empty. Nothing was there. I turned back to the mirror, my pulse thundering in my ears, and the figure was gone. For a moment, I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Was I losing my mind? I backed away from the mirror, my eyes never leaving it. The whispers had stopped now, but the air felt thick, oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. I didn't sleep that night. From then on, the mirror dominated my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was never alone, that something was always watching me. Even during the day, With the sun streaming in through the windows, I catch glimpses of movement in the mirror. Shadows that didn't belong, figures that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. The whispers became more distinct, as if they were speaking directly to me, just low enough that I couldn't make out the words. I stopped looking into the mirror, avoided the hallway altogether if I could. But even then, I couldn't escape it. The whispers followed me, growing louder every night, echoing in my ears, even when I tried to drown them out with music, with TV, anything. My reflection became a source of dread. I feared that if I stared into it for too long, I'd see something I wasn't supposed to. Then one night it happened. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the now constant whispering. It was louder than ever, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, overlapping, relentless. I covered my ears, but the sound was inside my head, gnawing at my sanity. Finally, I snapped. I stormed out of bed and marched to the hallway, determined to confront whatever this was once and for all. As I stood before the mirror, I felt something shift in the air. The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the apartment into an almost suffocating silence. I hesitated, then slowly, reluctantly, looked into the mirror. At first, all I saw was my reflection. But then, behind me, the shadows began to twist and move. I watched in horror as the figure from before reappeared, slowly materializing in the background. It was clearer now, more defined, a person, or at least the shape of one, standing in the corner of the hallway. But what made my blood run cold was that it was looking at me. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if observing me with an almost predatory curiosity. I spun around, my chest tight with fear, but again, there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I turned back to the mirror, and that's when I saw it. The figure hadn't just moved, it was standing right behind me. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a void, a black emptiness where features should have been. Then slowly it reached out. I could see its arm, pale, almost skeletal, stretching toward me in the reflection. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The cold, clammy sensation of fingers brushed the back of my neck, and the air around me seemed to thicken, choking me. I screamed. In that moment, I don't remember how I got away. I must have run, but all I remember is stumbling into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me, and collapsing on the floor, gasping for breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too terrified to even open the door. When I finally gathered the courage to leave my room, the apartment was silent again. The mirror, as always, hung there innocently, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something was in that mirror, something evil, something that wanted me. That was the last night I stayed in the apartment. I called in sick to work the next day and rented a van to haul the mirror away. I didn't care where it ended up. I just needed it gone. I drove it out to the middle of nowhere, a deserted field off some old country road, and threw it into a ditch. I could still feel its cold gaze on me as I left it behind, but I didn't look back. I didn't dare. For weeks after, I was terrified the mirror would somehow find its way back to me, like something out of a horror movie. But it never did. The whispering stopped, and I tried to get on with my life. But even now, years later, I can't escape the feeling that I'm still being watched. Sometimes, late at night, I catch glimpses of something in the corner of my eye. Just a shadow, a movement, barely there. And when I close my eyes, I hear it again, the whispering. It's faint, distant, but it's there. And I know, deep down, that wherever that mirror is, whatever was in it hasn't forgotten about me. It's still waiting, and it's watching. When I took the job as a traveling nurse, I knew that long hours and odd shifts would be part of the deal. But nothing could have prepared me for the experience at the remote, decrepit motel I stayed in during a particularly grueling rotation. The motel was situated on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by dense woods. It was the only accommodation available in the area, and despite its dilapidated appearance, I had no choice but to book a room for a few nights. The check-in process was unsettling from the start. The desk clerk, a frail elderly man with a tremulous voice and a vacant stare, handed me the key to room 309 on the 3rd floor. "Be careful up there," he said cryptically. "It's not like it used to be." I tried to dismiss his words as the ramblings of an old man, but his eerie tone lingered in my mind. The motel's exterior was worn and weathered, and the interior was no better. The hallway smelled of mold and mildew, with flickering fluorescent lights casting unsettling shadows on the walls. The 3rd floor, where my room was located, seemed particularly bleak. The carpet was stained and threadbare, and the paint on the walls was peeling away in long, curling strips. Room 309 was a corner unit, and as soon as I entered, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a rickety dresser, and an old television that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The window was covered with heavy, tattered drapes that let in only a sliver of moonlight. I noticed a small, antique-looking mirror above the dresser, its glass slightly fogged and dusty. The first night passed uneventfully. I was exhausted from my shift and fell into a deep sleep. However, I awoke in the middle of the night to a strange noise. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the direction of the window. It was faint but persistent, like someone gently tapping on the glass with a fingernail. I got out of bed and approached the window, but when I drew back the drapes, there was nothing outside. Just the dark expanse of the woods and the faint glow of distant streetlights. I shrugged it off as the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me and went back to bed. The next few nights were a different story. Each night, the tapping grew louder and more insistent. It would start around midnight and continue for hours, sometimes accompanied by a low, eerie hum that seemed to seep through the walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the old building settling or the wind rustling through the trees, but the noise was unnervingly consistent. One particularly unsettling night, as the tapping grew louder and more erratic, I decided to investigate. I crept out of my room and ventured down the hallway, following the sound. The 3rd floor was eerily quiet, with only the distant hum of the air conditioning breaking the silence. I walked to the end of the hall where the noise seemed to be coming from. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed a door that was slightly ajar. The number on the door read 312. I had not seen this room before, and it appeared to be unused. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the tapping noise grew louder, almost deafening. Inside, the room was dark and musty. The curtains were drawn, and the furniture was covered in white sheets. The source of the tapping was immediately apparent. A small, antique wooden table in the center of the room had a peculiar item resting on it. It was an old, dusty metronome, its pendulum swinging back and forth in a steady rhythm, producing the soft tapping sound. I approached the table, my heart racing. The metronome's swinging motion seemed almost hypnotic, and the room's oppressive silence made the ticking sound seem even more eerie. I reached out to stop the metronome, but as soon as I touched it, the tapping stopped abruptly. The room was now completely silent. I glanced around the room, feeling a sense of unease. There was something unsettling about the way the furniture was arranged and the layer of dust covering everything. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I noticed a photograph on the wall. It was a black and white picture of the motel's third floor taken years ago. In the photo, room 312 was occupied by a woman who looked disturbingly similar to the clerk at the front desk. The sight of the photograph sent a shiver down my spine. I left the room quickly and returned to my own, locking the door behind me. That night, the tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that made it difficult to sleep. The following day, I decided to confront the clerk about the strange occurrences. When I asked him about room 312, his expression grew serious. "You shouldn't have gone in there," he said softly. "That room has a history. It was closed off years ago after something happened." He refused to elaborate further, only saying that the room had been sealed for a reason and that it was best left undisturbed. I pressed him for more details, but he remained tight-lipped, his eyes darting nervously. My last night at the motel was the most disturbing. The tapping began again, but this time it was accompanied by a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from within the walls. The noise was relentless, growing louder and more frantic as the night wore on. I tried to ignore it, but the sound seemed to penetrate every corner of the room, leaving me on edge. As I packed my belongings the next morning, I noticed that the photograph of the third floor was no longer on the wall. In its place was a new picture, a close-up of the old metronome, its pendulum swinging back and forth in eerie stillness. I checked out of the motel as quickly as I could, eager to leave behind the unsettling experience. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the motel, receding in the distance. The third floor, with its haunted room 312, seemed to fade into the shadows of the woods. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something malevolent lurks in that room, waiting for the next unsuspecting guest. The tapping, the mournful wail, and the unsettling photograph all serve as haunting reminders of my time at the Willow Inn. The experience left me with a profound sense of unease, a lingering fear that sometimes the most unsettling things are those that remain hidden behind closed doors.